What if insects were the size of humans? Houseflies would be large enough to buzz around your head like helicopters, and ladybugs could land on your finger like a warm cup of tea. From wings to legs to antennas, all insects have one thing in common: they breathe through holes in their bodies called spiracles. These openings lead to a network of tubes called the trachea, which carry oxygen directly to the insect's tissues. It is how perfume spreads through a room, or how smoke fills up a building, or how smelly feet make the whole bus stink. Basically, molecules move from areas where there's a lot of them to areas where there's less. Not to mention the amount of food they would need to eat to stay alive. Like during the Carboniferous period, some 300 million years ago, oxygen levels were about 10 times higher than they are today. With all that oxygen floating around, insects didn't have to worry about getting their breath. So they grew big. Really big. Plants would quickly be eaten up, causing widespread famine. Many insects would likely die off, but others would become predators. Huge ants would attack people and pets. Giant mosquitoes would feast on human blood. Scientists have used CRISPR gene editing technology to create disease-resistant and fluorescent-colored insects. But none of them have grown larger than their normal size. In fact, most genetic modifications end up making insects smaller rather than bigger. So why don't scientists try to make giant insects on purpose? Well, for starters, who would want to? Bigger insects would mean more diseases and more damage to crops. Not to mention they would be a lot more dangerous to humans. Also, making a genetically modified insect the size of a human would require a lot more than just 1 or 2 genes. It would involve totally re-engineering their bodies, which could take decades, if not centuries. And it's not just about finding the right genes. It's also about putting them into the right organisms. Spiders would create webs across highways and buildings. And everything would be really, really gross. Take cockroaches, for example. And if we did that, we still wouldn't be able to control how those genes express themselves. Otherwise, they would be a much more powerful force to be reckoned with than they are now. In fact, scientists estimate that insects as a whole are 10 quadrillion times more powerful than humans. That's 10 raised to the power of 15. Of course, they're quadrillions of times smaller than us, too. But still, their real power lies in their numbers, not their size. And that's why. Genes are like software, and every organism has a different operating system, so to speak. You can't just copy and paste DNA and expect it to work the same way in another creature. Even if we could get the genes into the insects and get them to express the traits we want, we still don't know what else might happen. Insects have been on Earth for about 400 million years. During that time, they have changed very little. They're basically perfectly adapted to their environment. So it's hard to say what might go wrong if we start messing with their DNA. They have been known to survive nuclear attacks, not to mention being stepped on by people. But if a cockroach were the size of a person, it would need a lot more than its tough outer shell to survive. It would need to completely retool its body, including its nervous system. And even if it did all that, it would probably be no match for a human. At the time, there were giant dragonflies with wingspans of more than 70 centimeters, more than twice the size of today's largest living dragonfly. These enormous insects were likely able to stay aloft thanks to their huge wings and thinner air. But as oxygen levels dropped, giant insects became a thing of the past. But you might be thinking, well, why not let them be a little smaller than us? If insects evolved gradually over millions of years, they would have time to develop new ways of breathing, say lungs or gills, to help them survive. But if insects suddenly grew to human size after millions of years of natural selection, they'd have a much harder time. Without adaptations to support their huge bodies, they would collapse under their own weight. Not to mention wreaking havoc on our planet and our infrastructure. Imagine an insect that was half the size of a human. Would that work? Unfortunately, not really. When you think of half, you might think of smaller in half, but you'd actually be heavier. A team of super smart ants uses their combined strength and intelligence to defeat a giant enemy. It's a great movie, but don't expect it to happen in real life. As fun as it would be to see a bunch of giant ants take on a villain twice their size, it's not very realistic. For starters, ants already use teamwork to lift objects more than 50 times their weight. If they were bigger, they would need to evolve a new way of communicating. They couldn't just keep growing bigger and expecting their teamwork skills to save them. Plus, they'd need a lot of food to sustain themselves. They could probably get away with eating their colony mates, though, if they were the size of humans. That is, if they didn't all fight each other. That's because weight is affected by the cube of size, but volume is affected by the sixth. To make an insect half the weight of a human, you'd need to make it about 3 times smaller. But if you shrunk an insect down to 1/3 its size, its exoskeleton would be 6 times lighter, but its weight would only be 1/9 as much. In other words, shrinking insects would be no good either. Diffusion is great when you're small, like an insect. That way you can absorb what you need without having to use any extra energy to pump stuff around. But as you grow, diffusion doesn't scale up well. That's because the amount of surface area where molecules can enter your body increases with size, but the volume of space you need to fill up with oxygen goes with the cube of your size. So it's a lot harder to get oxygen into a bigger body than a smaller one. It's like trying to fill up 3 balloons with air. The first one takes a few breaths. The second one still takes a few breaths, but the third one, well, you'll probably need a fan. Unlike us, insects don't have lungs or blood that carries oxygen throughout their bodies. So how do they get their breath? But if honeybees were human-sized, their heavy bodies would crush them and they wouldn't be able to move. In fact, even the tiniest of insects would be better off being the size of an ant rather than a human. For instance, if you wanted to scale up a bluebottle fly to be the same size as you, its exoskeleton would need to be about 32 times larger than it is now. But the problem is, as an animal grows, its body doesn't just get bigger, it gets heavier, too. A full-grown human weighs about 100 times more than an average bluebottle fly. Scaling up the fly's exoskeleton 32 times isn't going to cut it. Its legs would have to be 32 times stronger, too, otherwise it would collapse under its own weight. Well, here's an Insect Biology 101 refresher. All living land animals need oxygen to survive, and most of them get it from the air by breathing. When you breathe, you take in air, which contains oxygen, through your mouth or a series of holes called pores that are located along the sides of your body. The oxygen then passes into tiny sacs in your lungs where it enters your bloodstream. Once in your bloodstream, oxygen travels throughout your body, delivering life-sustaining energy to your cells. Carbon dioxide, which your body doesn't need, is removed in exchange. It might seem funny to imagine animals we usually step on becoming our size, or even bigger, but there's a lot more to this question than meets the eye. Instead of lungs and blood, insects have a series of thin-walled tubes called the trachea that run throughout their bodies. These tubes open to the outside of the body with those little holes we mentioned earlier, called spiracles. Oxygen moves from the air in the spiracles into the trachea and then passes directly into the insect test tissues. So basically, they're kind of breathing with their skin. But unlike skin, which covers the outside of our body, the trachea are internal. Because they're inside, insects can't just keep making their tracheal tubes bigger and bigger. There's only so much room inside their bodies. So when it comes to getting their breath, diffusion is the word. And you may be surprised by the answer. So let's dive right in. But insects don't do things the way we do. Insects rely on diffusion to move oxygen through their bodies, and diffusion is pretty simple, really. Take a honeybee, for example. Its small size means it can easily get oxygen through diffusion. In other words, insects don't have the structural components to support themselves if they got any bigger. Okay, but what if we're talking about insects in the distant past? Which brings us back to the original question. What would happen if insects suddenly grew to the size of humans? It would depend on how quickly it happened. If they were bigger, insects would require massive amounts of food. Now, what if insects weren't just bigger, they were also super strong? You've seen Ant-Man. You know how it goes. But okay, maybe you're thinking this is all hypothetical. What if we could engineer giant insects? It turns out we already can. Even if we figured out the genetics of giant insects, we would have to find a way to put those genes into real insects. In the end, we should count ourselves lucky that insects are small.